Hello internet users, and welcome back to another instructional video on how to not play Pokemon. When it comes to soft-locking the Pokemon games, I'd say that the one generation I've gotten the least requests for has been the second one, and that's really not too surprising. Because of the focus on its real-time clock system, there are numerous daily items and events that can be accessed. Thus, the player almost always has a way to obtain more money in Pokemon, even if they got rid of everything intentionally. Of course, there have been softlocks discovered over the years. With similar setups to what I've covered before in Gen 1 and 3, you can strand yourself on some of the islands, unable to fly or swim to safety. However, for this video, I wanted to do something a bit more elaborate. By using the game's own clock mechanics against it, I wanted to see if I could craft a softlock with an escape so obvious, but also so obnoxious that nobody would ever try to seriously escape it. With that in mind, we're going to need the help of a weak little Pokemon. In this case, we'll be trapping ourselves with Caterpie. Now, in order for this lock to work the way I intend, it will need to be done on a Japanese Gen 2 cartridge. What you're about to see me do can still be done on the international versions, but as you'll see a bit later in this video, the Japanese versions specifically have a few quirks that will allow this setup to be even more infuriating. Of the three games, I'm going to be playing Pokemon Crystal. However, at times I will be using footage from the English version so that it's easier to follow along with what happens in this video. Without wasting any time, here is how to set up the save file. First, you just need to play the game normally up to a certain point, keeping in mind three very important details. Be absolutely certain that you never let your mother save money for you. If we're going to be throwing away all of our money and items later on, we obviously don't want her to have anything to give us later after that happens. As long as she isn't given anything, she will also not be able to buy and send the player any additional items through the PC's storage system. So remember kids, for this to work, you need to make sure that not even your mother can come save you later on. The second detail to remember is to avoid entering the Ecruteak City Pokemon Center. Doing so will trigger the event with Bill. This will come into play later on, so for now just avoid entering this building. And finally, make sure you don't pick up any of the fishing rods. They're all completely optional, and once they're picked up, you can never remove them from your inventory in this game. For this setup to work, it is very important that none of these are obtained at any point in your playthrough. Other than that, play the game like you normally would until you defeat Lance. That's right, this time we're actually going to need to be the champion in order for this to work. Despite that though, I promise you, we're still going to be putting this save file in a pretty pathetic state. The reason Lance needs to be defeated is because of this old man here at the Pokemon League. Ordinarily, when you speak to him, he will allow the player to teleport all the way back to New Barktown. The reason for this is because the Pokemon League is located in Kanto, and while the player is on the Kanto map, they are unable to use Fly to return to any location in Johto. In addition to being a quick way to get back to Johto, this man is also a measure to prevent the player from getting stuck. However, once the player has beaten Lance, this man will simply disappear. This is because that right after becoming the champion, Professor Elm will give you a ticket for the ferry that travels to Vermilion City. The game expects the player to start exploring Kanto, unlocking the ability to freely fly around to each town they visit. Because of this, the devs must have assumed that there was no longer any need for this man's teleporting service. Little did they realize, though, that this opens up a huge opportunity for the player to trap themselves. Now, with all of those things in mind, we're ready to begin the true setup to this lock. This begins as soon as you load up your game after defeating Lance for the first time. Number 1, catch a Caterpie. Heading over the Cherry Grove, you can find low-level Pokemon to the north. It is here that we will obtain the Pokemon we will be spending quite a bit of time with in the future. As a quick side note, Silver version does not have Caterpie in this location, and if you're playing that version, you'd have to get one by entering the bug catching contest at National Park. Although we don't need Caterpie specifically, the reason I've chosen it is because it is unable to learn any moves. Quite literally, Caterpie can only ever know the moves Tackle and String Shot. No TMs, no HMs, no level up moves, not even the possibility of egg moves. Because it has access to next to nothing, this makes Caterpie a perfect Pokemon to use for an obnoxious softlock. Number 2, go back to the Pokemon League. With Caterpie in hand, the next thing we're going to do is immediately return to the Pokemon League. This means that we'll be completely ignoring Professor Elm, who at this point is waiting to give us a ticket for the SS Aqua. It should go without saying, but when heading back to the League, it is important to use the same path you took the first time. If you enter from Viridian City, then this lock will no longer be possible to set up. You see, at the gate where the player's badges are checked, there are 2 NPCs blocking off 2 entrances. The one on the left guards Mount Silver and will not disappear until you've collected all 8 of the Kanto badges. The one on the right blocks the road leading to Viridian City. The event trigger to get him to disappear permanently is to enter this building from Viridian City. Most people might assume that he'd go away when you become the champion, but he remains here so that the player has no choice but to enter Kanto via the SS Aqua. Number 3, pick up every item available. For the next step, you can probably see where this is going. This trap is going to involve being stranded within a long stretch of areas. The starting point for this cage is when you cross the water after leaving Tojo Falls. The end point is, of course, the Pokemon League itself. So now, in preparation for what's next, we'll need to pick up every single possible item between these 2 points. This includes all of Route 26, Route 27, and Victory Road. There are also a few hidden items, so make sure you get those as well. Number 4, release all of your other Pokemon. Now that we're back at the Pokemon League, the next step is to release all of your Pokemon except for Caterpie. In the first 2 generations, there are no restrictions on what Pokemon can be released, so it's easy to get rid of all your Pokemon that know or are able to know HM moves. Number 5, get rid of all your items and money. You should all know how this goes by now. Spend everything you have and then throw your entire inventory away. Now we'll be unable to buy Pokeballs, and have nothing to sell either. And now for the final step. Heal and save at the Pokemon League. Once this is done, you will have succeeded in putting your save file in a very horrific state. Let's take a closer look at this and really examine how dire the situation is. Right now, our only Pokemon is a level 3 Caterpie. If we were to advance forward into the Elite Four, Caterpie would not be able to make it past Will's first Pokemon, let alone his entire team. Upon losing, the player will return to the Pokemon Center that was last used, which is of course the Pokemon League. If we instead try to go backwards, we'll have to go through Victory Road again. You might assume that this is impossible as well, due to the level of the wild Pokemon here. Every encounter would no doubt prevent the player from running away, and would result in Caterpie being knocked out. However, an easy solution to this is to simply save the game every time you take a step. Whenever you get an encounter, simply reset the game and continue the process. Although it may be tedious, this method guarantees that the player can always get through Victory Road regardless of what Pokemon they have with them. It's also worth noting that in Gen 2, there are no HM moves required for this area. So now that we're back at Route 26, we can continue the travel backwards until we reach the water's edge at Route 27. This is as far as we can go since Caterpie cannot learn Surf. At this point, all of the trainers on Route 26 and 27 would be defeated. However, there is still a way to battle some of them. A mechanic introduced in Gen 2 is the ability to exchange phone numbers with certain trainers. Occasionally, these trainers will call the player, sometimes asking for a rematch. This, however, won't make a difference in our current situation. Within the few areas that we're stuck in, there are a couple of trainers that can be rebattled. Unfortunately, they are simply too strong for Caterpie to do anything but lose. As well, a feature that is exclusive to Pokemon Crystal is that a select few of these trainers will randomly call and give the player special items. However, once again, the trainers we have access to are not among the group that can give these items. For Crystal version, there technically is an item-giving trainer on Route 27, but he is out of reach, requiring Surf to get to where he is. And if you thought you could try leveling up Caterpie from wild encounters, I'm afraid that isn't going to work either. For both routes in Victory Road, there is not a single possible wild encounter that our low-level Caterpie is capable of winning. This is exactly why we didn't pick up any of the fishing rods earlier in the game. If we had an old rod, it would have been possible to gain experience by defeating low-level Magikarp. But we didn't get it, and now it's impossible to go back for it. Now next I want to talk about trading. In the first 2 generations, it technically is possible to still trade with another game, even when you only have one Pokemon. However, I usually don't focus on that too much. The main reason I do these videos is to examine how a game can be made unplayable by exploiting its intended mechanics. In my opinion, if you've reached a point where you need additional hardware, software, and an add-on just to put your save file in a playable state, you've more than proven that there is a fatal flaw within the game's design. However, for this particular video, I've set things up so that attempting to trade will also be as inconvenient as possible for the player. As you'll recall, this has been set up on a Japanese version of Pokemon Crystal. When it comes to the first two generations, the Japanese versions are only able to perform a successful trade with other Japanese versions. Let's say, for example, you try to connect a North American Pokemon Gold to this Crystal cartridge. Although the games technically could initiate a trade sequence, the data on the cartridges are too different. If these two games were to go through with a trade, both would freak out, having no idea what kind of Pokemon data has been sent to them. This will result in the corruption of the save file of both games in this situation. You might be wondering, if that's the case, then why is a trade even allowed to occur between a Japanese and non-Japanese game? Well, at the time of Gen 2's release, the chances of this kind of trade occurring between casual players were incredibly slim. Whether the localization team was aware of this potential game corruption or not, it certainly didn't seem worth the time or effort to put in some kind of measure to disallow trading with Japanese cartridges. However, I should mention that in the case of the 3DS Virtual Console versions, the games actually do now prevent trading between Japanese and non-Japanese games. This is due to the fact that the VC releases make use of the 3DS's wireless functions to connect the games together. In the process of this change, it made perfect sense to stop a well-known game-corrupting issue with the original trade feature. It may have taken almost 17 years to address, but better late than never, I guess. But anyway, the point of all this is that in the save file we've set up, an escape via trading is only going to be possible using another Japanese cartridge. Additionally, during the setup, you'll recall that I said to avoid the Ecruteak Pokemon Center. Because of this save file does not have the time capsule event active, meaning that the player also cannot trade with the Japanese versions of Gen 1 either. It should also go without saying that the VC releases cannot connect to a Game Boy either. With this, we have severely limited what our game can even connect to. So let's say that once you've set up this softlock, you handed the Game Boy and cartridge to a random Pokemon fan and told them to escape. If they were to do this by using something other than the game itself, they would need the following: an additional Game Boy, a link cable, a Japanese Gen 2 cartridge, which in the current year will likely require a replaced save battery to work. And if they were to try and use Pokemon Stadium 2 instead, they would need a Japanese copy of the game, an N64 transfer pack, either a Japanese N64 or a modded N64 that can play Japanese cards. Remember, the goal here was to make trading as inconvenient as possible, and I think most would agree the majority of fans aren't going to have these things just laying around. If at that point you for some reason wanted to spend some money on these things, it would be much cheaper to just buy a cheating device to get yourself out of this. So for the people that demanded I take trading into account for the older generations, I've made it inconvenient enough to the point where cheating is infinitely easier and more affordable. By the way, a fun fact. Sometime after I recorded footage of myself walking through walls, when I booted up the English save file, my character had suddenly changed into a girl, while still having the color palette of a boy. This won't go away no matter what I do, and I have no idea why this occurred, as I've messed with this exact cheat plenty of times in the past with no issues. I know that there is a well-known glitch that lets you do this intentionally, but I swear I didn't do anything close to that. I'm only just guessing that my brief instance of walking through walls was what triggered this, because I really have no other way to make sense here. So anyway, for the rest of this video, some of the English footage will now feature my changed character instead. I didn't want to replay the entire game again just to keep the last few pieces of footage consistent, but I'm pretty much forced to edit in an explanation now so I don't get 1,000 comments asking what's going on. Just pretend that everything is fine, and add this to the list of nonsense you're seeing in this video. But anyways, that aside, as things are now, you may be wondering if there is still any other options available to the player. Compared to some of the other softlocks I've previously done, this one gives us quite a bit of extra room to wander around. But still, we're seemingly stuck with no way to continue playing the game normally. Provided that you've done the setup properly, it really seems like there's nothing you can do except start a new game or wander around endlessly letting Caterpie get knocked out. However, in this situation, there is still one thing you can do. One tiny detail that provides the obvious, but obnoxious escape I mentioned earlier. Within our prison, there is only one single way to obtain more items, and it comes from this tree here on Route 26. Because Gen 2 introduced both a time system and held items to the series, there are plenty of these trees placed throughout the game. Once per day, the player can pick items like berries from these trees. Because these are pretty much an infinite source of obtaining items, the sell price and positive effects of these berries are very minimal. For this particular tree, we can pick an ice berry, which when consumed heals a Pokemon's burn. So you might be asking, well, if there's a tree here, then all you have to do is pick enough berries to sell until you can afford a Pokeball, right? And you're correct. That is absolutely what we're going to do. However, doing that is not as nearly as simple as you might expect. You see, if you were to take that Ice Berry all the way back to the Pokemon League, you would discover just how little value it has, only being worth literally 5 Pokédollars. Now next, you need to realize that a standard Pokeball costs 200. That means that in order to afford a single one, you'll need exactly 40 Ice Berries, which means that in order to escape, you'll need to wait for at least 40 real-life days to pass, making sure to check in daily to obtain every Ice Berry. That certainly sounds annoying, doesn't it? But it isn't the most unreasonable thing in the world. After all, once you have that single Pokeball, it's just a matter of saving and resetting until it actually catches something. Then you can teach that Pokemon Fly or Surf and get yourself out of here. Unfortunately, if you thought it was going to be that easy, I've got some bad news for you. You see, in Gen 2, at the Pokemon League, they don't actually sell Pokeballs. No, they only sell Ultra Balls, which cost 6 times more than a normal Pokeball. I think you can see where I'm going with this. So, in this scenario, this means that the escape method will require you to pick 240 daily Ice Berries, all just for the chance to obtain another Pokemon. And this is exactly what makes this particular trap so cruel. Going back to the idea of giving this cartridge to a random Pokemon fan to try and escape, just imagine how someone would react. At first, they'd probably appear to be really confident, since they appear to have such an open area to explore. But as they wander, they'll soon realize that they actually can't do a single thing besides interact with this tree. And once they realize how much the berry is worth and how long it'll take to afford their escape, I guarantee you that the life in their eyes will fade in the most satisfying way imaginable. But right now, there might be some of you out there clinging to hope, asking, what if you just manually change the game's clock until you have 240 berries? And unfortunately for you, I also thought of that too. So most people don't seem to be aware of this, but in Gen 2, there is actually a secret method to changing the in-game clock. In Gold and Silver, by pressing down, select, and B at the same time on the title screen, the game will ask you if you'd like to reset the clock. Upon hitting yes, you'll then need to enter a password. The required password is actually generated based on a few different factors within the current save file. All of these things are the player's name, ID number, and money. However, that information by itself isn't enough to tell you everything. Using one of the many tools you can find online, you can enter this information to figure out what your generated password is supposed to be. Once this is entered, the player can now set the day of the week and time to whatever they desire. In Pokemon Crystal, the method to accessing the clock reset function was made a bit more obscure. This time, on the title screen, it must be done like this. First, you need to hold down, select, and B. Next, you need to let go of down and B. Now you have to hold left and up on the D-pad. And finally, let go of the select button. Once this is done, you'll be brought to the same screen that was seen in Gold and Silver. The password you need is also determined the same way as before. Considering the roundabout method of accessing this function, it's more than likely that this was only intended to be used for testing purposes by the developers. But with that explanation out of the way, you might have figured out what needs to be done next. In order to accelerate the process of collecting 240 Ice Berries, you're just going to have to painstakingly adjust the clock over and over, entering that password many, many times. Sure, that will no doubt take a lot of time to do, but it's still a lot shorter than waiting 240 real-life days, right? But like I said earlier, I had considered this as well, and this is yet another reason why we are playing on the Japanese version of the game. For you see, in all Japanese versions of Gen 2, this clock reset feature is inaccessible to the player. Despite how clear it is that the player isn't supposed to be using this menu, it was for some reason made accessible in the international releases. This means that in our game, the player has absolutely no choice but to wait for a real day to go by before they can ever pick another Ice Berry. And there you have it, folks. No out-of-bounds glitches or sequence breaking required. After making use of several intentional game mechanics in unintended ways, we have created a save file that is virtually unplayable without a 240-day-long commitment. Of course, there is no way that anyone would ever do this to themselves by accident, but the point is, you technically can do it. To give you an idea of just how long 240 days is, let's say for example you started and picked your first Iceberry on January 1st. You would finish just before the end of August on the 28th. That's 8 long months of checking in daily just to make your game playable again. A completely consistent escape method that requires no RNG, but it's so obnoxious that nobody would ever actually go through with it. Thank you all for watching. My name is Caterpie, and have a nice night. Thank you all for watching. If you want to see more stuff from me, you can always click on the things you see on screen here. On my other channel, I've also started another 6 Smeargle playthrough on Pokemon Fire Red. Be seeing you all next time.